So my name's Sarah Worton, and I'm from the Institute of Education. We're part of UCL, which is University College in London. And I also have had the privilege of working with QRTA for the last 3 years with the TPD, the pre-service teacher education program that they've been running. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is actually the kind of work that is happening within the diploma, and I'll be drawing on a lot of the conversations that I've had with the teacher educators at QRTA. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. I'm not sure I've got this on quite right. I'm not used to having a microphone. Okay. So I'm going to talk about practitioner inquiry. And the reason that I want to talk about that is because it's about professional development for teachers. And I think it's broadly assumed now that if we're going to have some improvement in educational standards in schools, that people within schools agree that actually it's practitioners, it's the teachers who can lead that change. So in the past, we may have had researchers from universities who are the people who perhaps come and do research in schools. But actually there's a bit of a shift in understanding that actually it's the teachers themselves who are going to lead change in school. So I'm going to be talking about how practitioner inquiry, how being a teacher who inquires, and I'm quite pleased that at the end of the keynote speak there, it was clear that what Tina was also talking about was the importance that teachers also have agile minds, that are the people who ask questions, that model what they want to see in their students as well. So it's the teachers and their questions that I think can be one of the ways in which we can promote change in teaching standards. The other reason that I think it's quite an interesting area to look at for professional development is it has the ability to challenge perhaps the hierarchies of knowledge and where knowledge comes from. And my background is in sociology, so I'm always quite interested in knowledge and power and who has knowledge and who has power to do it. And so it's actually about rethinking who is it, who are the knowers? And when we're talking about education and teaching, it is often the teachers who have the very particular context-specific knowledge to be able to be the people who shape change and who move things. So I think it leads us to rethink a little bit about where knowledge should come from and who should be the directors of change. Okay, so the learning outcomes there you can see. So hopefully by the end you'll have an understanding of the process of practitioner inquiry. We'll have a go at doing some of the skills involved in inquiring into your own practice. And I hope that by the end you'll see that actually practitioner inquiry could be a useful tool for professional development. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to start with is to try and understand a little bit about the process of practitioner inquiry, what it is. And the work that I'm going to be drawing on, and there's references at the end of this slide, is largely from three main authors. One is Elaine Hall, who I'm going to show you a little video clip of in a moment, Marilyn Cochrane-Smith, and Nancy Feichman-Dana as well. So I'm going to show you a little clip of Elaine Hall talking about what practitioner inquiry is. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thanks.
So, practitioner inquiry is not so much a method, although it's often associated with action research, because action research is a common methodological approach within practitioner inquiry. Practitioner inquiry is about the practitioner, whether they're a teacher, a lawyer, a doctor, or a social worker, thinking about their work in a very curious but also very systematic way. So it might be that it follows the cycles of inquiry as in traditional action research. It might be something that looks more complex and organic, from general tinkering in the classroom or in the office to something that's an in-depth case study or an autoethnography. So practitioner inquiry is actually quite broad. Most of our work in practitioner inquiry has been quite closely allied to action research methods because we've been working with large groups of practitioners and providing a particular kind of structure.
We're interested in practitioners who are questioning and are wanting to think about how they can make their practice better. And that's by inquiring into, in depth, either what's going on or what happens if I change something. And so you see different scenarios playing out in how they explore what's going on. And it's about thinking about evidence and the evidence they can collect to know whether what they're doing is making an impact.
Okay, so there was a very brief description there about what Elaine Hall and her colleague thought practitioner inquiry was. So I just wanted to start off by trying to find out from your perspective whether you have any understanding of what practitioner inquiry is as a teacher or as an educator, and if you've had any experience of it. So can I just ask you to talk for a moment to someone near you? Is this something you've ever engaged in as a teacher? Do you have some understanding of what it is? And then we'll feed back a little bit about what people's ideas of what practitioner inquiry might be.
It's okay, open the door.
I think so, yeah. Okay. So anyone sort of feel like they've already engaged in this? They've gone through an experience of doing some practitioner inquiry. Does anyone mind sharing? Yeah.
What we add on to our perspective is that practitioner inquiry is more like the art of asking questions, but not just asking questions as they said as a method, but asking and answering it, and then following up on those answers if they work, if they not work, and then re-asking other questions to continue further on, as they said, as an action research.
Okay. So definitely the word action research was mentioned there, and we'll talk about names for this in a moment. So yes, something about the asking of questions and then perhaps asking more questions. Have you ever done this for your own practice?
Personally,
yes.
We run like a growth mindset test.
Mm-hmm.
We pose a question or like a topic, and then after a couple of weeks, everyone tries it out and come back and say what worked with you, what didn't work with you, why did it not work with you. So we do a sort of reflection to question.
So a group of teachers where you work. Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Anybody else have a slightly different interpretation? Yeah?
As a organization, we have a in-service program, in-service training program for the teachers, and we have a part of this program action research.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's more simple than action research what we saw in this video. The teacher, if he faces a simple problem, he can put the question and assumptions and do some research on this about the solutions of this problem, and then we can write a report and try a solution inside his classroom or her classroom, and then write a small or a simple report about the solution that he used and how he get the solution and the result of his action research.
Okay, thank you. So there's a few sort of themes coming out. Something about asking questions. Something, both of you have mentioned something about sharing findings, whether that's in a group or a written report, so something about sharing the findings. You've started to talk there a little bit about finding solutions, and I'm going to kind of park that a little bit and come back to it, because I think that's something that's quite important when we start to think about what practitioner inquiry is. It's also not limited to teaching as well. So you'll notice that Elaine Hall there, she talked about this being whether you're a lawyer or a doctor, but what it shares is something that people who work in practice, in professional context, who are practicing their particular profession. So we'll come back to that in a minute. So I'm kind of getting the impression either people are not willing to share yet, or it's completely new to them. So we'll see how we go. So I'm going to start off by asking what's in a name. So we hear many different terms for this. Action research is coming up. Teacher research, teacher reflection, practitioner research, professional inquiry, professional inquiry, and the difference between perhaps the two. School-based research or research. So the reason I put this up is not really to kind of diminish this debate, because I think that they do all mean slightly different things. But I think what we need to think about is what are the shared characteristics? So what is it that all of these kinds of activities might have in common? And that's why I've started to write a few things up there, that there might be some things that they all have in common. So just as a starting point, it's worth asking why inquiry with an E and why inquiry with an I. And you'll see it written differently in different literature. And inquiry with an I suggests something about an investigation, something that we're going to try and pull apart, investigate a particular problem, a particular experience that we're having. Whereas inquiry with an E is more about asking a question that might have an answer to it. And the reason that I've used the one I is because there may not always be an answer. So it's not a straightforward question that we can solve the answer to. So we're going to talk about practitioner inquiry, but what I would say is some of the common characteristics of all of those on the left is that they put the practitioner in the role of a researcher, somebody who has something meaningful and useful to say about the practice. That there is a professional, the context of the profession is the site for the research. So in this case, the school or the university or anywhere where somebody learns, the research takes place in that place. That it's characterized by collaboration and community. It's not something that you do isolated or alone. And that there is a bit of a perhaps blurring sometimes between what is inquiring into your practice and what is evaluating your practice. So what is deciding what is good practice and what is poor practice, and actually just investigating practice. Sometimes there's a blurred line between that. It perhaps also offers some new conceptions of validity. What is valid knowledge? What is reliable knowledge? But what it does also offer is some sort of systematization of research. So there is some sort of rigor to this. So as teachers, we always talk about what works and what doesn't work. What have you tried in your classroom? How are things going? We do that all the time, and that's how we operate. But actually, if you put in some system and some rigor to those conversations, then you're starting to develop more into a sense of what an inquiry might look like. So starting to systematize it, and we'll talk about how that might happen in a moment. So the question is always, is this research? And some people say yes, and some people say no. And the reason that perhaps some people say no is I've put up the Frascati definition. So this comes from the OECD definition of what research is. And to satisfy something to be research, it has to have these 5 criteria. Novel, something new, something creative, something uncertain that we don't know the answer to, something systematic, and something transferable or reproducible to another situation. So if we say that practitioner inquiry is about a teacher, in this context, doing some investigating in their classroom, are there any of those 5 criteria that you think it doesn't satisfy? Sure. So if you're a teacher in the classroom and you're investigating into what's happening in your classroom, we could call that research if it met all 5 criteria. So my question is some people say it's not research because it doesn't meet one of those criteria. And I wonder if you have an idea of which one of those 5 criteria it does not meet. Yeah.
Uncertain.
Uncertain. So do you know what's going to happen in your classroom? Somebody said yes, somebody said no. Who says no? Mm-hmm.
You start with a hypothesis and then you test that hypothesis.
Yeah.
So you have a preliminary idea what to expect.
Okay.
Or not to expect.
Okay, so you might have a hypothesis, but is it certain that you're right? Could things happen that you're unsure of, that you didn't know were going to happen? The reason for something to be called research is because we shouldn't necessarily have all the answers. There's no point researching something if we know what the conclusion is going to be, right? So there's no point. So this approach, I think, would satisfy uncertain. If I ask a question, which is, why do some learners readily answer questions and put their hands up and others don't? I could say there's 10, 20 reasons why that might be. I don't know what they all are. So I could ask a question, but my answer might be uncertain. So that's the point of doing the research, to see if I can find out the answer. So is there another criteria that you think it doesn't satisfy? If what I find out in my classroom, yeah. Absolutely. So it is difficult to make a claim that what I find out in my classroom is the same as in any other classroom, because it depends who my students are, depends on the culture, the context that I'm working in, depends on the subject, it depends on the age of the students, it depends on a whole range of different factors. It depends on me as the teacher as well. So often people might argue that this kind of activity is not research because it doesn't satisfy that last criteria. But that doesn't, I don't think that really matters, because what we're talking about when we're talking about practitioner research or practitioner inquiry is asking questions and sharing findings. And increasingly in education, there is a really strong platform and movement towards using practitioner inquiry to set up professional learning communities. So it becomes a platform and an area in which professionals, teachers, can discuss teaching and learning issues and learn more about their own practice. And that's why this session is about full professional development. So it's about teachers themselves learning more about their practice so that they can improve their practice and they can keep learning as a teacher. So whatever it is, whatever practices they may favour in the classroom, things that they think work, things that they've experienced, things that they've learnt, things that have been done to them, that they keep questioning that practice, they keep thinking about it, and they keep wondering whether this is actually something that is working or something that I can think about a little bit more and try different things. Okay, so what is it? There's a list there. Is it teachers being engaged in research? Is it teachers being reflective? Is it teachers gathering data and information? Is it them engaging in their professional development? Is it taking action to improve their practice? And that's where the term action research comes from, doing something to change your practice. Or is it about gaining some insight into your practice? You think it's all of them? Yeah. Yes, so practitioner inquiry would include all of those, but in some ways the most important one, I think, is the last one. It's about understanding what we do, what we do and how we do it and why we do it. So we understand a little bit more about what we do as teachers. So this is adapted from some other work by Lasonde and Ritchie, but this is just to give a bit of a distinction, because reflection has been the kind of main theoretical lens for teacher education for a very long time. And teacher reflection is really important, really key, but it is different to inquiry, and this is where the systematicity comes into it, having clear systems for doing this. So as teachers, whether you're doing inquiry or reflection, your goal is to improve teaching and learning. If you're reflecting, you ask questions, and this is what I was saying, that teachers do this all the time. They ask questions. How did your lesson go? Or did you try that new thing? How was it? Yeah, it worked out well for me. Our students seem to respond well. And we ask lots of questions and we discuss it. When you do a teacher inquiry or practitioner inquiry, you intentionally ask a very specific question. So you set out right from the beginning to try and understand something very specific, an issue that interests you. And that's a lot less overwhelming than trying to think about everything in the classroom. So again, as Tina was saying, the classroom's quite a complex environment. Lots of variables. Remember when she was saying the boat at sea? Lots of things that we could think about. If we came back from that sailing trip, we could talk about everything. The weather, all the different things that she was talking about. But if I was just interested in one particular thing, then it allows me to be much sharper in looking at that particular area. When we teach and when we reflect on our teaching, we collect information. How do students respond? We look at their work, we grade their work. We collect lots of information about students all the time. In teacher inquiry, you're just focusing on one particular part of data collection. So it might be how students, how many questions students answer in a lesson. It might be how well they interact with their colleagues in the classroom, how they talk. Could be something very specific. And so you collect that information and reflect on that. And as I said, teacher reflection can often feel a bit overwhelming. So you come out of the classroom and think about everything that happened, and you don't always share it. So it can feel sometimes a little bit isolating. But what's really key about this is about the sharing of the findings. So it benefits from ongoing collaboration. You want to work with your colleagues. You want your colleagues to ask you questions about your practice. You want to ask questions of your colleagues about practice. So it incorporates it, but it's also a little bit different, and reflection alone is insufficient. So I'm going to use some responses that I gathered actually when I was working at QRTA about what some of the teacher educators there thought inquiry was when we asked the question, inquiry as a stance. So I'm going to ask you to do the same thing. So this is how it's described by the authors that I mentioned. So Marilyn Cochrane-Smith and Nancy Weitman-Dana call it inquiry as a stance. So just have a moment to think, what do you think that means? What does it mean to say that it's a stance? Again, if you just have a conversation on your tables for a minute, and we'll take some responses. or as a stance, yeah. Okay. So, what do you think that means? What do you interpret that as? To say that you take something as a particular stance, I should say. My English accent's coming out a bit strongly. A stance, to talk about inquiry as a stance. What does that mean?
Action and reaction.
A reaction, an action and reaction. Okay. What did other people interpret it to mean? Yeah.
It's a situation that means a solution.
Okay. A particular situation. Anything else? Yeah.
You're asking towards that while you're asking that question or while you're inquiring.
Okay. Might be a particular attitude. Any other interpretations?
Maybe it is a starter to grab the attention of the students or to make them engaged.
Okay. A start of something. Yeah. It's the approach. Okay. Yeah. A feeling. Okay. Okay. So lots of different interpretations of that. So the idea of taking a stance might mean to take a particular position, to adopt a certain position. And I think some of these are already positions. Perhaps the idea that there could be an action and a reaction, that there could be a situation with a solution. So those are having a particular stance. You believe that there is a solution, or you believe that there could be a reaction to a particular action. But I think a stance is more about having an attitude, an approach, perhaps a feeling, a position. So if I take a particular stance, I take a particular position on something. Here are some of the other answers that people talked about. An approach, that came up, an attitude, that's there as well. So the idea that you take a particular approach, a questioning approach, an inquiring approach, that it's about leading the classroom, leadership in the classroom, leading as a practitioner, changing perhaps processes in the classroom, a journey that you're going on as a teacher, a particular perspective or a viewpoint, that it's a transition, that it should transform your experience as a teacher, and that it's perhaps a subjective position as well. And I think sometimes people struggle with this because we like to think we're being objective. We like to think that we're being very, very objective and that we're not taking a particular position. But in teaching, we always tend to take a subjective position. We take it for it because it's a human interaction. It's a very personal thing. We can't help but be subjective sometimes in our positions about what we believe and assume is good teaching. We might learn a lot about strategies and pedagogies and approach, but at the end of the day, I think there's always this position that we need to accept, that we are talking about a particular value judgment when it comes to teaching. So this is the idea that inquiry is about looking at something through a particular lens or approach. And I'm going to use the idea of the lens just for now. So when we look at something through a lens, what tends to happen, or what can happen when we look at it through a lens? Yeah.
Visualize what is going to happen in the future.
Okay, so we can start to perhaps, yeah, predict or see what's in there. We can see the smaller picture here. Zoom in, yeah. Focus, absolutely. Focus on certain things. It will become clearer, we hope. Yeah, absolutely, it will become clearer. Smaller, yeah, you can look at things in more detail. Yeah, I'm looking at more details, prioritize things, specific. So I think this is quite a useful metaphor for thinking about inquiry. So if we think about me at the moment in an environment where I'm a teacher and you're learners, I could take a particular position. So if I stand over here, I will see a different view of the classroom than if I stand at the back or if I stand at the side. Everything looks different. If I took out a lens and I focused it on just this table, because this was what I was interested in, I would have a different view. If I changed the colour of my lens and I went to a green colour, it would look different again. So inquiry as a stance is this idea that we take a position, we take a view of the classroom, and we really zoom in on it, and we try and understand it differently, in a way that perhaps we haven't thought about it before. We ask questions about it. So it's all about questions. It's all about question posing. And it's often not always being able to find the exact answer, but it does give us more understanding of what's happening. And again, I'm going to refer back to what Tina Blythe was talking about in her, I thought, really inspiring keynote presentation, which was saying that it's not always about the idea that we can find solutions to these problems, but it is always about trying to understand things better so that we can make different choices and make choices that perhaps are right for our context, right for our situation. And so that's what inquiry as a stance means, I think. So I've put a little summary there of what it might be. Intentional and planned reflection. It's planned. It doesn't happen in the moment. It has to have some thinking through beforehand about what it is that we're interested in. So it's intentional and planned. It's focused on problem posing, not problem solving necessarily, although we might find some interesting solutions to things, but it's about asking questions. And you can see it when you discuss and debate with your peers and your colleagues. So a summary there is a tool for describing and discussing a pedagogical issue in an analytical way.
So it's not about finding solutions, it's about how to deal with it.
Well, it's about, I think, if I go back to my original, the first slide when I said, what is it? And I had that list. Let's go back to that. This one. I think it's about the last point. It's about you as a teacher understanding an issue better. So when you understand something better, it might help you to solve a problem, and it might help you to make a different choice. Yeah. Or get better, because you become, I suppose, to use the theme of the conference, to become more agile. So the more we understand of an issue around teaching and learning, the better we become perhaps at adapting to another situation, or seeing something before it's going to happen, or understanding the way in which people respond to certain things. So we become more skilled as practitioners. I'm not saying that it, as a practice, can solve every behaviour problem in the classroom, or it can solve the problem of differential attainment, why some students do better than others. I don't think it has, I don't personally believe anything has the power to solve those problems in one fell swoop, because I don't believe in education there are any magic solutions to things. I think it takes a lot of commitment and hard work and constant questioning and constant thinking to become better, become more agile as practitioners. And it's also about professional development, constantly wanting to develop your practice. Does that answer your question? Yeah? Okay. So we'll move on to think about how we do this then. How do we develop some skills for inquiring into our classroom? What are the kinds of questions we might ask? What counts as evidence to help us to answer those questions or to help us to understand those issues a little bit more? And what do we learn from it? What's the process involved? So again, I'm going to refer to Dana again, Nancy Dana Feitman, who talks about these different passions that teachers have. And so when she did her research and looked at lots of different practitioner inquiries, she said that there were 8 passions that within the complexity of teaching that cause teachers to ask questions as they experience difficulties, dilemmas, problems in their classroom. And they were often about one of these 8 things. They might have been about the child or the children. There might have been a question about the curriculum, what they have to teach. There might be questions about the kind of knowledge that is informing the curriculum, so perhaps even their subject knowledge as well. They might be very focused on strategies, techniques, approaches in the classroom. They might be about their beliefs about practice. I had a really interesting conversation with one of my trainee teachers the other day about what she believed about mixed ability teaching and teaching within ability groups, so streaming and banding. And she had very, very firm beliefs, and she didn't really understand that other people might have different beliefs. She was very clear about what was the right way to go ahead, and she hadn't really thought that that was something that she believed. And we do all have those beliefs about teaching. It might be to do with professional identity. This is also a really big thing if you work with young teachers, and I mean young in the profession, not in age necessarily, but they often struggle with becoming, taking on the professional identity of teaching. It might be about social justice, what you think about inclusion in classrooms. How do you ensure that everybody has equality of access to the curriculum? It might be a question about your context. So why does my school do it in this particular way and the school down the road does it differently? So these were the kinds of passions that teacher inquiries were based on. They may fall out of these, but these are the sorts of things that people try to talk about. So what I'd like you to do is to try and think of an area that interests you. Perhaps it doesn't have to be formulated in a question, because we'll get onto that. But do you have any particular passions? Is there something about your profession, teaching, as a practitioner, that you are particularly interested in, that is a passion for you? And you don't necessarily have to share this, but just have a moment to write something down, because we're going to come back to it. So just reflect on that. Feel free to talk if you want to, but something that you feel particularly passionate about, that you'd like to develop more in. Okay, so just keep that in your mind. We're going to come back to it. I'd like to now look at a little extract from a teacher who, this is kind of a commentary of what he or she, I'm not sure, was thinking through when they were trying to develop an inquiry question. So something that interested them and their development. I think on your tables there's one, it's just turned over a blank sheet in front of you. So if you have a moment to read through it, I'll give you probably about 10 minutes or so to have a look at this. Can you see if you can try and answer those questions about this particular case study? So what was happening that led this teacher to want to ask a question about it? What was their dilemma or problem? What were they experiencing? What role did literature play? So in here you can see that this teacher has perhaps read something that they found quite interesting and helped them. What do you notice about the question that he or she asks? And how do you imagine he or she is going to go about answering this question? And what kind of insight do you think they might gain from doing this? Okay? I'll kind of come round and speak with people as you're looking at that. I've got a couple of spares if you need an extra one. Okay, so let's just come back together a little bit and think about these questions. So I'm going to call this teacher Sarah because it will be easier for me. So what was Sarah experiencing that led her to an inquiry question? What was she experiencing, do you think? Yep, so she was perhaps having some experiences where it was going quite badly, disappointing, and it was falling apart, yeah? But sometimes she said as well that sometimes it went well. So she said, I've experienced great satisfaction. I asked a student a question and they gave me the correct response. And she was pleased with that experience and they get it. But on the other hand, I have experiences when it's falling apart. So that was her situation. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I think we've all had that experience, yeah? So she's starting to think, well, why? Why does it work this time, but it doesn't work this time? So I put this question because I think this is important. There's a whole world of educational research out there. And as teachers, sometimes we just think about our classroom, our practice, or our school, what happens in our school. But she's read something. What did she read from the literature? What did she read in educational research? Yeah.
Elementary school teachers asked about 348 questions during the day.
Yes. Yeah. So she read, elementary school teachers ask a lot of questions every day, about 350 questions a day. It's a lot. Too much, maybe too much. Maybe she's thinking that. Maybe she's thinking that's too many questions. Are all those good questions? Or were they useful questions? Yeah, coverage, exactly. A lot of coverage.
Questions can stimulate student thoughts and enhance or reinforce the basic skills of the students while they are answering the questions, and involve students, the shy students, in order to raise their self-esteem, for example. So this is based on the research.
Absolutely. So the research, I maybe should have written the word research, but the research or the literature out there has told her that questions can be very powerful. They can be very useful tool for a teacher, but they can also be used badly. And there's a lot of research that says actually, if you ask too many questions that are based on low order skills, that you get passive students. They switch off, they drift off, they're not interested. Yeah. So again, we probably know this as practitioners. So she's starting to read around what the research tells her, and that's helping her to think through her own practice, what she does as a teacher. This one, what do you notice about the question? This is the last paragraph.
I noticed that as teachers, we all ask this question.
Yeah.
What type of question do I ask? What is the suitable question for that?
Okay. That question, yeah, please.
She believes that she has experienced great satisfaction when she got the correct answer.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the problem, because there's no one correct answer to all questions. I mean, like, her questions only address a certain level, only that is yes or no.
Mm-hmm.
But she wants to experience more a skill of more effective
Questioning, yes.
And that's why questions should vary. I mean, like, they shouldn't be only yes or no questions.
Yes.
There's no one correct answer to all questions.
Yeah, I think that's an important point about closed questions. Yeah, Z.
Her question doesn't zero in on why aren't these students getting my questions. She's actually reflecting on the implications for her own practice in terms of what do I need to do to have students respond and understand the heart of the question.
Absolutely, thank you. So her questions, right, these are her inquiry questions. This is what she's asking about, as Z says, herself, her own practice. What type of questions do I ask as a teacher? What do I ask them? And how does questioning change when I change subject? She's elementary, so she's going between subjects. So she's got two quite open questions. So when we said at the beginning you might have a hypothesis, I can't remember, we said there might be a hypothesis. So she's not really hypothesizing here. She doesn't sound like she knows the answer. She might have a hunch. She might have an idea. But she's asking a very open, exploratory question about what she does as a teacher. So we notice the questions are open. They're focused on her and her practice. So how would she answer this? How is Sarah going to go into her next class and try and find something about the answer to these questions? What type of questions do I ask? How does questioning change when I change subjects?
Well, I thought the suggestion, it's not really I thought maybe I was in this problem, in this situation. I would like to ask a colleague to come in and maybe write down all what's going on in the questioning process while I'm teaching my class and see the responses of the kids, what kind of questions. Then I can go back and really reflect on my questioning. That may help me to improve them and to make them higher standard.
Absolutely. So that would be one really useful way. Ask a colleague, I'm looking at my questioning techniques. Please, can you come in and watch and write notes on the kinds of questions that I ask and then you come back and look at it. Absolutely. Anything else that you could do? Yeah.
She might ask a question that has more answers or not just direct answers.
Okay.
Yeah, the question that lead to inquiry or to research and things like that to get many answers to the question.
Yes, so she may turn to the research. That might be another thing that she tries to do. Yeah. So she might look to the research. So apart from asking a colleague, how else could she investigate the answer to this question?
Yes.
Yes.
We might push the students themselves to create some questions and to ask one of the students to ask somebody else some questions, or to make them create some questions that as a feedback in order to see what problems did they find in the case, or what problems did they find in the problem itself.
Okay.
That are working in.
I agree with you, but I think what you're jumping to, which is what we all do as teachers, is trying to find the solution before we've investigated the issue. So I think using the students is a great idea, but you could ask the students to tell you as a teacher, what kind of questions do you ask? And then that might lead you to changing some practice. But there's this, we as teachers, because we're very strongly rooted in practice, we go straight to solutions. As much as possible, we always move to solutions. So the point of inquiry is to step out of your practice for a moment, look at it through whatever means you can, use your students, use your colleagues, film yourself, record yourself, that's another good technique. So just put your phone on to audio record yourself. There's obviously difficulties about filming students in classrooms, but if the camera is just on you, not on the students, then it helps you to see what you're doing. So you can look at your own practice. What do I do when I'm a teacher? How do I move my hands? You know, we all find these strange things that we do as a teacher when we start to look at our practice. So this inquiry approach, the focus is on you as the practitioner. Of course, you want to look at how that interacts with students. You might collect data from students, evidence from students, but you're looking at yourself. And what will she learn? We don't know at the moment, but she's going to hopefully learn something about how she asks questions. And perhaps she's going to learn about how students respond. And perhaps she's going to learn about how she might change her practice in future to see if it makes any difference. Maybe I'm going to limit myself to 5 questions every lesson, and I'm going to plan those questions, and they're going to be really good questions. It might change her practice. So that's what the inquiry is hoping to do. So that's just a little case study to show you how you might think through an issue. So I want you to go back to that passion now that you identified before, and to see if you can have a go at writing an inquiry question about you. So not about your students, about you, what you do in the classroom. Try and keep it open. Try not to hypothesize if you can bear it. It's quite hard because we often have a hunch. Probably it's going to be pedagogical. It's going to be related to learning, which it should be. It will be based in practice, and hopefully it will be clear. So these are quite simple questions. What kind of questions do I ask? Keep it clear and simple, and something that you could actually find the answer to. Okay? So, and then if people are willing, I would like to hear a few as well. So 5 minutes, see if you can write your own question about your practice. Okay.
Quite powerful for your students.
I appreciate that the first time you do this, it can be quite tough, because when I'm talking to people, what we tend to do as well as teachers is we want to ask questions about the students. And there's nothing wrong with asking questions about students and student learning, but that's what we do always as teachers. We're always asking questions about student learning. This is about you. So this is about what do I do as a teacher. So we had one discussion here. Do you mind sharing what your question was? The one you came to in the end. Okay, so what kind of teaching resources do I use in the classroom? Or could I use in the classroom? So we all make choices about what kind of resource we use. And in the case we were talking about teaching English, if I was to use a particular piece of text to teach English, then I've made a choice that this is the resource that I'm going to use. So you could investigate what kind of teaching resources do I use in my classrooms. And that's, again, we can answer that. It's very clear what the question is. We could go and look at what kind of resources do I use. We could review our resources. We could ask students to tell us what they think of the resources. And we could start to build an inquiry based on that. So if perhaps some of the research out there tells us you should use this type of resource when you're teaching this particular skill, we might check, do I do that? Do I use those kind of resources? So we start to ask questions about our own practice. And it will lead to another question, probably. A second or a third question about the kind of resources that we might want to use or should be using, or what we think might work. Anybody else come up with a question that was about themselves, not about their students? Yeah.
Well, it started to be about children. Now
Yeah.
after you just mentioned this, I just turned it around.
Yeah.
So the question was, why do kids feel that school isn't their house, or they don't feel the belonging?
Yeah.
Now I changed it to a different way, which is, how can I help my students become more, or feel more belonging to their school?
Okay. So I'd even change it even more. What do I do to promote or to make students feel more safe or at home, or whatever the wording is? What do I do? It's often a good way to think about it. What do I do, or what do I use, and ask a question in those ways? Because then you're looking at yourself and your own practice. And the thing with this is, it's cyclical. It doesn't stop, unfortunately. We were just talking about it. It doesn't end. I mean, unless you want to stop developing, then it will end. But if you want to keep developing your practice, you keep asking questions. And when you perhaps have got some insight into one question, it's going to lead to another one. And then you've got another question to think about. So I'm just going to, these slides were made available to you, so you don't need to worry about it. But these are some of the things that you might want to look at when you're asking questions. What kind of evidence might you collect? There's all kinds of evidence in classrooms. All sorts of things that you might look at. Some resourcing, some questioning, some teacher behaviour, some looking at student work. See here things about textbooks, worksheets, those are about the resources. If you have questions about content knowledge, you might be looking at curriculum materials, those sorts of things. So we're going to move to, do you want me to go back one? Yeah? Yeah. We will move to the last objective in a moment, which is to think about why this might be useful and to think about why this might be a powerful form of professional development. And I think when you do that, it's important to recognise what the limitations are. It doesn't solve all the problems, and it doesn't pretend to either. So it can be quite hard, and this is what we want to do, to make a claim about causation. So what I mean by that is it's quite hard sometimes to make the claim that because I did this, they did that. Because we don't always know that that's the case. And so that's why it's more about developing yourself rather than always trying to think about everything that I do has an impact on the students and the students' learning. It's more about self-development rather than trying to solve the problem in the classroom. It is unlikely to be described in quantitative data. So it's not about a set of test scores, usually. It's usually about an observation of yourself and your own practice. So it's usually something more qualitative, something described in words. It doesn't provide proofs, and it doesn't claim to. It doesn't prove that this one thing is the reason. And as I said at the beginning, it doesn't provide magic solutions to all of the problems. And as we said right at the beginning, it may not be transferable to other contexts. So what we learn in one context may not be the same in a different classroom, in a different year group, in a different school. However, I think it does have a lot of value. It can help you to get to know your students. So if you're asking your students perhaps something about what you do, how well do you think I ask questions? How useful are the resources that I give you? You get to know what your students, how they respond to things. So you get a closer understanding of your students. It can help you challenge your students more as well. So again, perhaps the questions you've been asking in that case that we had with Sarah are a bit low level, and the students say, they're not very hard, those questions that you ask me, miss. Could you ask me something harder? It helps you to perhaps challenge them a little more. It helps you to monitor progression as well, because it helps you to be very focused, perhaps on an area that you want to get progress in. It helps you to make good decisions. So the more I know about my practice, the better my decisions are. If I've analysed something, I can make more informed judgments. It develops you as a teacher. It helps you to look at the research, which I think is really important. So once you ask a question, you go, who else knows about this? What kind of research is out there that can tell me something about this topic? It promotes progress, I think, for you and for your students. And this goes back to the stance part. It's a way of being. It's taking a particular approach. It's being a questioner as a teacher, not just expecting it in your students, but asking yourself to answer questions. It helps you to avoid assumptions. So it helps you not to assume that something is the case, but actually to find out if it is the case. Investigate it. And it helps you to collect and analyse data, perhaps on some conceptual understandings about yourself. Often it can improve your planning, and it makes you a learner in your own practice, learning to be a better teacher. But it's not about learning to be a better teacher by coverage. Again, as Tina was saying, it's not about just getting lots of information and then learning that way. It's about problem solving, problem posing and investigating your practice. So it has purpose and value. So I just wanted to leave you with that slide and ask if there was any particular questions. I know it's probably quite a lot to take in an hour and a half. But anybody have any sort of questions or comments that they would like to make about this particular approach?
Since now it's more of learning and teaching rather than teaching and learning. So the more you learn about yourself, the more your teaching methods or approaches or pedagogies become better. So one influences the other. They're interconnected. So inquiry into yourself, into your students, into your strengths, your weaknesses, your practice, all what we mentioned will make you a better teacher.
Yeah, thank you. So it definitely, it speaks to that idea that it recognises that we're learners.
I believe so. This approach when it comes to teachers and to keep updated with everything that's happening around the world, technology, community with teaching, and innovation, whatever happening around the world, because it's a good thing that it's updated.
Yeah.
Rather than, using the same strategies of.
Yeah, it's a way some people describe it as looking out the window, so that you kind of are thinking about what you do, but are also looking out the window to what others do.
I think this kind of where it needs to have teamwork rather than
One person, yes.
Because this will help to match the whole system.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. It is something that is it should be part of a community response. Doing this on your own, in your own classroom, while everyone around you is not doing it, is quite difficult. So it's a bit of a cultural shift in perhaps the mindsets of how teachers learn to become better teachers. And it's not, it's very much based on perhaps having a principal or administration in the school seeing that as a powerful learning tool for professional development. That can be a really, really strong way of doing it. But that's not to say that you can't introduce it within your own professional development communities or your professional learning communities. Okay. Thank you very, very much for your participation and attendance today, and I'm here if anybody wants to ask any questions.